welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is managing the status of your on-premises data gateway using PowerShell. So let's talk a little bit about why this episode is important. So naturally, when we talk about RPA inside of Microsoft and Power Automate more specifically, the on-premise data gateway is a core component as it allows us to bridge any cloud-based orchestration with a local device. Now, whenever you have local devices, naturally you have some maintenance that is required for them. For example, Patch Tuesday, things of that nature. So you may want to be able to proactively monitor the status of your gateways, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And we can naturally do that programmatically through the use of PowerShell CMDlets. And now, since Power Automate Desktop allows you to execute PowerShell from a run PowerShell script action, we can go ahead and automate that. And that's what we're going to really focus on today. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. Now, there are some prerequisites in order to get all of this working, so I want to spend some time talking about that just to help save you some time if you're trying to set this up for yourself. So number one, you do need to download PowerShell 7. And PowerShell 7 is a prerequisite because of the Power BI PowerShell CMDlets that we're going to use. Those have been written in PowerShell 7, and as a result, we need to make sure this is installed on our machine. So here's where you can go ahead and grab the latest version of PowerShell, and I will include a link in the description of this video to help you out from that perspective. The other thing we're going to need is an Azure AD app. So when we go ahead and we run this process, we are going to use Service Principal, and we will need to go create that Azure AD app in order to support that Service Principal requirement. Now, when you go ahead and set this up, the most important thing to do here is you've got API permissions and you need the Power BI service. And then these are the two operations that we're going to be calling underneath the hood: tenant.read.all and tenant.readwrite.all. Now, do note, these do require admin consent, and for good reason. When we run this, we are going to run this using an organization scope. So we are going to go ahead and discover all gateways in our environment. That is certainly a requirement for all of this monitoring scenario itself. Another thing is, and this will be covered in the actual PowerShell scripts that you do write, but we are going to take advantage of this data gateway module. Now, this is provided by Microsoft, and so that is what we need to do, is we need to go ahead and install it, because shortly here we're going to go ahead and import that as a part of our script, and naturally it needs to be there in order for us to go ahead and use it. Once again, more information at the following link. I'll include that in the description itself. Once it's installed, then we can go ahead and we can import it, and this will be part of our overall scripts that we'll talk a little bit more later. In addition, I also want to just call out this documentation page. This will give you all of the different operations that you can go ahead and use inside of PowerShell. Now, we're going to talk about two specifically: the Get Data Gateway Cluster and the Get Data Gateway Cluster Status. And so let's talk a little bit more about those operations. Now, this is going to be very similar. I can't say for certain that this is used under the hood, but it feels pretty similar. This is a screenshot of the administrative gateways experience inside of the PPAC, the Power Platform Admin Center. And here we can see I've got 4 gateways that are installed, And in this case, one of them is online and the remaining 3 are offline. And so what we can go ahead and do is we can essentially discover all of the gateways that exist in our environment by using the get data gateway cluster commandlet. Now, this won't give us the status. We have to use the ID value that is returned from this call in order to actually get the status of a specific gateway instance itself. Also note that it is being called here as the cluster. It's a single operation that supports both clusters and non-clusters. For the purpose of my demo here, I don't have any clusters installed, so don't let that name mislead you. Okay, and then here is the subsequent call that I just spoke about, so get data gateway cluster status. And as part of that, we do need to provide that scope, which in this case is that organization. You can also have scope for an individual user as well, but as I mentioned, we want to focus across the enterprise. And then what we do need to do is feed in a gateway cluster ID, which was the same ID that we talked about in the previous slide itself. Now, when we make this call, we will see a status. In this case, it'll be none, which essentially means offline. And then if a cluster is online, we will see a value of live. Now, in order to simplify things for everyone, I've got 2 scripts that we're going to see in the demo itself. I've made those scripts available, and what you can do is you can find them on my blog. Once again, I'll include this link in the description just to save you from typing. Okay, so let's go in and let's see a demo and see this in action. Okay, so before we see the demo run, let's talk just a little bit about the desired outcome that we're looking for. The desired outcome that I have is I want to be able to find all of the gateways that are in my organization. I want to determine their status. And then what I want to be able to do is I want to go ahead and to be able to put them in a spreadsheet. And this is just part 1 of a multi-part series. So we're going to talk about how we can build on top of it. But for today's demo, the goal is to get to this point. The name of the gateway ID, the status, none or live, as I mentioned before in the slides, and then the time in which it was last updated, and this would be local time itself. So we can go ahead and, let's just go ahead and delete this. Now, along the way, I am going to have some files that I do use in order to capture the output from the PowerShell, and then what I do is I do ingest it in my pad script here, my Power Automate desktop script itself. So if we go ahead and we look at these specific scripts, let me just run through a couple of them. So I'd say the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get our list of gateways. And so this was a screenshot that I did show you earlier in the slides itself. But this is the type of output that we're going to get back from PowerShell for each gateway that we do find. Right here we've got the ID, which becomes very important when we try to get the status. And then also name is something that is interesting for us. And so you can see that this is essentially a repeating block, right? So that's one gateway. And then we've got the next gateway. So this is going to be a little bit fun when we try to go ahead and parse out this output from PowerShell itself. So that's one of the files that we're going to use. The other is this current gateway status. So once we've been able to get this prior output, the list, we are then going to one by one go ahead and find and make that call to get the individual status. And here we can see for this specific gateway, there is a value of none. So we're going to essentially loop through all of these gateways that are returned and then one by one check their individual status, and then we'll be updating that Excel spreadsheet along the way. Now, first up, we talked about this before, and when we talk about how we put all of this together in part 2, these will be values that do get passed in from Power Automate API flows. But for now, since we're just exclusively talking about PAD, here's where I've got my app ID, my secret, and my tenant ID itself. And these are values that will get injected and passed into our PowerShell scripts, making them more portable. And those are the scripts that I've made available on my blog itself. So something to be aware of from that perspective. And, so these are obviously, partially cut off, so they won't do you any good. So let's go ahead, let's just close down this right-hand menu here, and we'll focus more on the core workflow itself. Now, there's a lot of things going on here, so I'll try to go sort of as reasonably slow as I can. But the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we get our Excel spreadsheet set up. So I would envision that this type of script gets run, say, every hour, or maybe every half day, or maybe once a day. And so as a result, we're going to have that Excel file, and we want to make sure we always have a fresh Excel file that we can go ahead and leverage. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I have a subflow here. And the subflow is essentially going to copy a templated version of that spreadsheet and place it into a temp folder, and then we're going to exit this subflow. So if we take a look at what this looks like, I go into template, and now I have just a very simple Excel file here. So what's going to happen, every time this runs, we're going to take a copy of this, and we're going to put it into this working folder that we have here. So that's step number one. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and run our PowerShell script. Now, this is one of the scripts that's available on my blog post. And if we look at it, we'll find it here. It's going to be getGatewayList.ps1. Let's go ahead and edit it. And now as part of this, what we're going to do is pass in arguments. So basically our app ID, our secret, and our tenant. We're then going to construct a secret string because we naturally need to do that. And we will go ahead and we will connect to the, number one, we'll create a connection to the gateway service account using those values. Then what we'll do is we'll import the data gateway module, and then we will go ahead and execute the get data gateway cluster operation. And we're going to do this at the organization scope, and we're going to output the all of that data to a file itself. Now, when we call this gateway script here, do note that I have this PWSH. What this means, and by no means am I an expert in PowerShell, but what I was struggling with was I couldn't just embed all of this script in this little window here. Maybe that's not the best idea anyways. But what was happening when I did that, it was always looking for PowerShell 5. And so by indicating this PowerShell command here, I know that it's going to execute in the context of PowerShell 7, which is super important in order to take advantage of the Power BI gateway commandlets that are being provided here. So at this point, we're going to output that, and we're going to have basically our list of gateways. I'm then going to go ahead and I'm going to split the file up based upon a new line. Because remember, it was kind of ugly, right? We have all of these different sections, and I need to be able to parse through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, for every new line, basically split this up, and it's going to become essentially a list. Now I'm going to go ahead and then launch. I can create a list here just to manage some of the data. And then what I can do is launch the Excel. So Excel will now be open. And then what I'm going to do is for each row, essentially, I'm going to go ahead and get the current item text. And what this is, I'm just storing it as subtext. And what my goal here is I want to be able to determine, I want to find what row starts with ID and then a space. And the reason why I have space is just in case some other field, decided to start with ID, I wanted to make sure that I had, at least a little bit more predictability from that perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get the subtext for that. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm also going to create another subtext action, which I'm going to store the gateway name. And so the goal with this one is I'm going to go up to the first 5 characters. And the reason for that is that I also want to be able to track this value here. I want to be able to figure out, that ID of this belongs to Surface Pro 4. And so that's why I'm also doing a second step, which is something similar. Then what I'm going to do is check to see if this subtext is equal to ID space. If it is, I know that I want to further parse that row. And what I can do is I can split that row using a delimiter. And what that is going to do is that is going to allow me to retrieve this value, because we're going to basically take this row of text, split it into 2, and then I can use the index to determine which portion of this essentially array I want to go ahead and use. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and at this point we will have the ID value for our gateway. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is call our second script, which is going to be get the gateway list status, and we're going to provide the value, basically that value of this ID, and we need to pass that into the secondary script. And so when we do that, we can go ahead and then essentially we're going to follow a very similar pattern. Now for each row, because I know that right now I have an ID, I need to be able to capture that in Excel. So what I'm going to do is now I've already opened up my Excel spreadsheet. I've launched it here. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get the first free row. And then what I'm going to do is start to populate it. And in this case, I'm going to take my ID and I'm going to place it into column B of my spreadsheet. If you recall, if we go back to our spreadsheet here, we've got column B, which is gateway ID. We've got column A, which is gateway name, status, and last update. So we're going to populate the ID into column B. Now, we also want to capture the current date time, and I'm going to go ahead and do that using this action, get current date and time. And I'm going to choose the system time zone, so the local time zone where PAD is installed. So we'll go ahead, we will add that into column D. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to then get the status for that specific gateway. Because we've run the PowerShell script here, we're going to read the file. And in this case, that's that current gateway status.txt. And here, this is where we now need to parse this value. And so once again, we're going to follow a fairly similar pattern where we will read it. We will then go ahead and split the text based on new line. We will get the subtext, and in this case we're saying it's length of 14, and the reason for that is we have this cluster status, right? So this is 13 characters, same thing, we'll just make sure, and we'll have an extra space to say, get me the first 14 characters. Now if the first 14 characters equal cluster status, space, then let's go split it again, and we'll once again use a delimiter. And then what we'll do is we will write the value of the cluster name also into that Excel spreadsheet. The cluster status into that Excel spreadsheet. In this case, it's column C. Now, the last step in our loop is we're then going to go ahead and get the gateway name, and we will go ahead and capture that from like the original text because we've already processed the ID, and we have also got the subtext just in case it is name, and so that's why we're going to then just go ahead and process the name. Once again, if we see that the name is equal to, the gateway name is equal to namespace, we know we're on the right record. We'll then split it based upon the delimiter, and then we will go ahead and add that name into the Excel spreadsheet. So I know there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of parsing. I think obviously you can kind of choose other parsing mechanisms if you want, but what you're really bound to is just the outputs from PowerShell itself, and I'm certainly not a PowerShell expert, so there might be better ways to be able to go ahead and to modify that output, but for now, this is the approach that I've gone ahead and taken. So let's go ahead, let's run this. This will probably take a minute or so to run, so I will naturally fast forward through the recording. All right, and there we have it. So that concludes this specific demo, and as you can see, we're able to go ahead and get the desired output that we want. Naturally, we can go ahead now, load this into, say, Power BI, and basically load it and then share that dashboard out with other folks. And whenever this refreshes, that data will be updated naturally, and people will have the overall status of the gateway without needing to go to the Power Platform Admin Center or other tools as well. Okay, so for next steps, one thing that we can do to this is we can actually enrich it, but also including who has access to this specific gateway, whether they're the owner or they are a user. So that might be some additional information that we're interested in capturing. And so that's what we'll look for on part 2, is how we can include this information. And then we can also look at how we also stitch all of this together and call it on a scheduled basis and perhaps even load it into Power BI. We'll see. So thanks again for tuning into this episode. If you're not following me on Twitter, go ahead and find me at Weare. On top of it, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I publish content at least once a week. And if you enjoyed this episode, likes are always appreciated. Thanks and take care.